So let's talk crustaceans. As I said at the end of the last video, there have traditionally been four major subphyla of arthropods. So again, domain, Eukarya, kingdom, Animalia, and then we usually talk about phyla, but these are groups of phyla. So sometimes you have to jam things in between the major layers. So between kingdom and phylum, we have subphyla: chelicerates, myriapods, hexapods, and crustaceans. Now hexapods are probably somewhere underneath Crustacea in something called Pancrustacea, but we're going to talk about these different groups on their own for the moment. Chelicerata, or chelicerates, are named for their feeding appendages called chelicerae, and the earliest known chelicerates were Eurypterids, which are these giant, 6-8 foot long water scorpions found in the oceans, and those are extinct. But horseshoe crabs exist today, which look kind of like Eurypterids. And these guys are ancient. They've been around 500 million years in essentially the same form. And these guys have chelicerae, these little mouth parts. The majority of modern chelicerates are arachnids, and so mostly spiders, but also scorpions, ticks, mites, and a few others. And in these guys, the chelicerae are the fangs on a spider. So the fangs that inject the venom are the end part of the chelicera up front, and these guys have chelicerae as well that do slightly different things. Arachnids generally have two main segments: a cephalothorax, which, insects have three segments: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The head and the thorax are combined together into the cephalothorax. And they have 6 pairs of appendages: 8 legs, so 4 pairs of legs, but also a pair of chelicerae, the fangs, and a pair of pedipalps, which are little feeding appendages that are also involved in a reproduction in spiders. They have a respiratory structure that's different from what you'll find in insects. It's similar to what you find in the horseshoe crabs that we just looked at. They have these book gills on the bottom, and they're called book gills because they're like, pages laid on top of one another to increase surface area. Well, spiders have a similar structure, but it's evolved to get oxygen out of the air rather than the water, and so we call them book lungs instead of book gills. Also, they produce silk, which is a kind of wild thing. It's made of a protein, and we'll look at how that happens in a second. So here you can see the walking legs, the pedipalps, and these are the chelicera up front. Again, these are the fangs, and so you can see the poison gland up here that leads down into the chelicera. Here are the book lungs. Again, they look like pages of a book lined up next to one another. They have an open circulatory system like all arthropods. They tend to paralyze their prey with venom, and then they shoot digestive enzymes into the exoskeleton of whatever arthropod they've eaten and digest it inside that arthropod's exoskeleton and to make it a goo, a liquid, and they slurp it back up. So they don't really chew. They digest it, externally, and then suck it into their intestines. Back here, you can see silk glands and these spinnerets. These silk glands produce these silk proteins, which again are lots of amino acids. They're polypeptides, and they sort of lock into shape as they come out and hit the air, and they become solid, and it's really strong. For the size, it's significantly stronger in tensile strength than steel, but it's also incredibly flexible and bendable, and so it's really excellent for catching prey and doing other things too, like you may have seen a spider, if you knock it off of a table or something, right? It can come right back up because it had a drag line that they hook on the end of the table so that they don't fall to the floor. They can come right back up. I could talk forever about spiders, but I'm going to move on so that we have time to talk about other things. Like, for instance, myriapods. Myriapod means many-legged, and it includes the millipedes, which have 2 pairs of legs per segment, and the centipedes, which have 1 pair of legs per segment. The legs are essentially the same all the way down. They have mandibles instead of chelicerae as eating structures. And here you can see the 2 legs per segment on a millipede and the single leg per segment on a centipede. Millipedes are usually detritivores. They'll eat leaf litter and whatever, and they're scary looking but harmless. Centipedes can actually be venomous, and sometimes they are dangerous. So, look out for the centipedes. Some of them are gigantic. I mean, there are centipedes that are this big, and you'll find them moving around in caves eating bats. I mean, they're frightening. The third traditional subphylum is Hexapoda. Now, again, most recent phylogenies have them placed within Pancrustacea, which is a group that includes Crustacea, and these would be sort of within that. But Hexapoda means 6 legs, and the vast majority of hexapods are insects, and there are some other relatives. And they're primarily terrestrial. Some of them live in freshwater, not in marine habitats, but mostly terrestrial. And they have some interesting organ systems. Insects specifically have evolved wings, right? Wings are one of the neat things that you find, they've evolved independently in a few different phyla, so including birds and bats amongst chordates. But they evolved first in insects, and they sort of took over the skies that way. They also, instead of having lungs in the sense that we do, or spiders, chelicerates tend to have those book lungs, meaning you have a single structure where you have a lot of exchange of gases and then a circulatory system that moves it about. They have these tracheal openings on the outside, so there are little pores out here called spiracles. The spiracles open into tracheal tubes, and the tracheal tubes just bring air directly to lots of different organs all around the body of the insect. So it's a totally different way of going about gas exchange than lungs are, like we have. They also have a cerebral ganglion, kind of like a brain. They have 6 walking appendages and mouth parts, a ventral nerve cord. Notice that I keep saying ventral nerve cord in a lot of these organisms. We have a dorsal nerve cord. That's going to be something that distinguishes chordates when we talk about our phylum. Insects make up a huge number of the species of animals that you find on Earth, and they've diversified multiple times following the colonization of land, following the evolution of flight, and the adaptation to feeding on gymnosperms, like pine trees essentially, and then even more so after the evolution of angiosperms, flowering plants, because a lot of insects are pollinators for these flowering plants, and so they've expanded in terms of adaptive radiation of species together. Flight specifically has also allowed for adaptive radiation because it allowed them to colonize a bunch of habitats they wouldn't be able to colonize otherwise. They can spread out more quickly to new habitats and new niches, and they also can obviously escape predators or hunt from above, which is a whole new advantage that other organisms didn't have. Like all arthropods, and really ecdysozoans, right, they molt. They have to shed their hard exoskeleton in order to get larger, right? And they step out of their old exoskeleton with a soft outside. They breathe in, make it as big as possible, and then it hardens. And a lot of insects undergo incomplete metamorphosis, meaning essentially the younger molts look a lot like adults. They're just smaller, and they don't have fully functional reproductive organs. But a ton of insects undergo complete metamorphosis, and this means that the earlier molts look completely different from the adult molts. They have an egg, first of all, but then they have a larval stage, which looks like a grub or a maggot or a caterpillar, right? It looks like a little worm and inches along. Very different from the adult stage. Then you have a stationary pupa, right? And you can look at a butterfly as an example of this, a larva to a butterfly. And the pupa is what we call a chrysalis in the butterfly. And then you emerge from that pupa as an adult with wings and reproductive organs looking very, very different from what you look like in earlier stages. They reproduce sexually. Most are dioecious, again, with 2 different sexes. And we're pretty familiar with a lot of insects. A lot of them have bright colors, sounds, odors. You go out on a summer night and you hear them everywhere. Many are economically impactful, either beneficially as pollinators or harmfully as pests, carriers of disease, and there are more than 30 orders of insects. There are lots of them. Here are some of the major ones in terms of those with incomplete metamorphosis. Hemiptera and Orthoptera. Hemiptera is the true bugs. When you say bug, you really are talking about hemipteran, so stink bugs, things like that. Orthoptera, which includes grasshoppers. And then complete metamorphosis, we talked already about butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera, but Hymenoptera, which includes the social insects like ants and bees and wasps. These are fascinating, and we'll talk about them more when we get to behavior, but they have these incredibly complex and socially intertwined societies that have evolved. Diptera are just the regular flies, right? Fruit flies, things like that. They're called Diptera because they only have one functional set of wings. Most insects have two sets of wings, but one of the sets of wings in flies is vestigial. It doesn't work. And then Coleoptera. And Coleoptera are the beetles. And there are over 350,000 species of beetles. They are everywhere. They are one of the most diverse and successful orders of animals, well, the most, really. There was a guy one time, was a biologist, and he said, I don't know if there's a God, but if there is, he is inordinately fond of beetles. So arachnids and insects have sort of taken over the land. Freshwater and marine environments are pretty much empty of arachnids and insects. There are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, they're only terrestrial. Whereas the aquatic and marine environments are full of crustaceans. And crustaceans look a lot like some insects, right? They're arthropods, but they have gills rather than lungs because they have to breathe underwater. There is one group of terrestrial crustaceans, and that is the isopod, or the pill bug, or the roly-poly, or whatever you call them, potato bugs. But other than that, they all tend to be marine. Again, with the exception of the fact that insects, hexapods, probably do fall under now pancrustacea. Decapods are huge order that includes lobsters, crabs, crawfish, shrimp, most of these guys that we think of. In addition to crabs and lobsters, krill are tiny little planktonic arthropods. There are lots of really little shell, exoskeleton arthropods out there. And even barnacles are arthropods. Copepods are a prominent example of these crustaceans that are planktonic. They're small and they just sort of float around the water. And some of them are neat. I've seen occasionally on the beach bioluminescent copepods. So they have bacteria that allow them to light up. But all of these arthropods have a cuticle that is an exoskeleton made of chitin that they have to molt. They all have segments that have evolved to do different things, and they all have jointed appendages, again, many of which have evolved for various different functions in various different environments. And because of all those things, they're really adaptable, and arthropods have been able to diversify and expand in just about every habitat you can imagine, and they are the most diverse animals in the animal kingdom.